The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when cattle rancher Marcus Brennan made the discovery that would haunt him forever. What he found, half buried in the snow beside Highway 287, wasn't just a frozen body. It was a young woman, barely alive, whose first words would send him on the most desperate search of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Brennan had seen his share of Montana winters, but the storm that rolled through Cascade County in February was unlike anything in his 43 years. The wind howled across his ranch with a fury that seemed almost personal, driving snow so thick he couldn't see the barn from his kitchen window. For 3 days, he'd been trapped inside his farmhouse, listening to the radio crackle with storm warnings and checking on his cattle through the security cameras he'd installed last spring. The power had gone out twice, and each time Marcus had fired up the generator, knowing his livestock depended on the heated water troughs to survive. His nearest neighbor, the widow Sarah Chen, lived 8 miles down the county road, and he hadn't heard from her since Tuesday. The phone lines were down, cell towers overwhelmed, and the internet connection had been spotty at best. On Thursday morning, the wind finally began to die down. Marcus pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his weathered face, and stepped outside for the first time since Monday evening. The snow came up to his waist in some places, creating drifts that completely obscured familiar landmarks. His red pickup truck was buried under what looked like a small mountain of white. He spent the morning digging out his truck and checking on the cattle in the nearby pasture. Most had huddled together near the windbreak he'd built from old telephone poles and sheet metal. A few were missing, probably sheltering in the ravine on the far side of his property. As he counted heads, Marcus noticed something troubling. Several sets of tire tracks cutting across his land, partially filled with fresh snow but still visible. The tracks didn't belong to any vehicle he recognized. They were too narrow for his truck, too wide for Sarah Chen's old sedan. Someone had been on his property during the storm, which made no sense. The county road was impassable, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here in weather that could kill you in minutes. Marcus followed the tracks as best he could, but they disappeared where the wind had swept the snow into smooth, featureless drifts. Whoever had been here was long gone. Still, the discovery left him uneasy. In 20 years of ranching this land, he'd never had uninvited visitors during a storm. By afternoon, he decided to attempt the drive into town. The county road might be cleared by now, and he needed supplies, coffee, batteries, and propane for the generator. More importantly, he wanted to check on Sarah Chen. The elderly woman lived alone and had been battling pneumonia just before the storm hit. The first mile was treacherous. His truck slipped and slid despite the chains on all 4 tires, and twice he had to gun the engine to power through drifts that came halfway up his doors. But the county had been busy with their plows, and the main road, while still hazardous, was passable. He was making good time when he saw the car. It was a small, silver sedan, nose down in the ditch about 50 yards from the road. At first glance, Marcus assumed it was just another casualty of the storm, someone who'd slid off the icy pavement and walked to safety. But as he slowed his truck, something caught his eye. The car's rear window was completely spiderwebbed, as if something had hit it from the inside with tremendous force. Marcus pulled over and grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment. The snow around the vehicle was disturbed, marked with what looked like footprints, though the wind and fresh snowfall had obscured most details. He approached carefully, his boots crunching through the crust of ice that had formed over the deeper snow. The driver's side door hung open, and the interior was filled with snow. But there was something else, dark stains on the upholstery that made Marcus's stomach tighten. He'd grown up hunting with his father and knew what dried blood looked That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it over the wind. A soft moan, barely human. Marcus spun around, scanning the landscape. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere behind the car. He waded through the snow, following the noise, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was maybe 20 yards from the vehicle, buried so deep that only her face was visible above the snow. Her skin was blue-white, her lips almost black with frostbite. Ice crystals had formed in her dark hair, and her eyes were closed. For a moment, Marcus thought he was looking at a corpse. Then her eyes fluttered open. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." Marcus dropped to his knees beside her, brushing snow away from her shoulders and chest. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing what had once been a red winter jacket. Her clothes were soaked through, and he could feel how cold her skin was, even through the fabric. "I've got you," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You're going to be okay. What's your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Marcus pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around her, then began the careful process of digging her out of the snow. She was conscious, but barely responsive, her body temperature dangerously low. As he worked, she grabbed his wrist with fingers that felt like ice. "My baby," she whispered, her eyes suddenly wide and desperate. "My baby is still out there." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked around frantically, scanning the white landscape for any sign of a child. Where is your baby?" "Took him," she managed, her grip tightening on his arm. "They took him from the car. I tried to stop them, but—" Her voice trailed off and her eyes rolled back. Marcus checked her pulse, weak but steady. Hypothermia was setting in fast, and he needed to get her to a hospital immediately, but her words echoed in his mind as he carried her to his truck. Someone had taken her baby. In the middle of a blizzard, with temperatures below zero, a child was somewhere out there. He cranked the heat in his truck and wrapped the woman in every blanket he could find in the cab. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the 20-minute drive to Cascade General Hospital, mumbling words he couldn't understand. Sometimes she called out a name, "Dylan," and once she grabbed his arm again and said, "Red Barn." They went toward the Red Barn. Dr. Amanda Foster met them at the emergency room entrance. She was new to Cascade General, a young physician who'd moved to Montana from Chicago just 6 months earlier. Marcus had met her once before when he'd brought in a ranch hand who'd been kicked by a horse. "Severe hypothermia," Dr. Foster said after her initial examination. "Core body temperature is 89 degrees. We need to warm her gradually." "How long was she out there?" "I don't know," Marcus replied. "At least since the storm started, maybe longer. But doctor, she said something about a baby." "Said someone took her baby." Dr. Foster's expression grew grave. "She's been hallucinating. Hypothermia can cause severe confusion, false memories. People in her condition often imagine things that aren't real." But Marcus wasn't so sure. The broken rear window of the car, the blood on the seats, the tire tracks on his property, none of that was imagination. Sheriff Tom Whitfield arrived. An hour later, stamping snow off his boots and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus had called him from the hospital, though he wasn't sure what to report. A car accident? A kidnapping? The whole situation felt surreal. "Hell of a storm," Whitfield said, accepting a cup of coffee from the nurse. "Roads are still a mess. We've had 6 accidents since Tuesday, but this is the first one with injuries this serious." Marcus told him about finding the woman, about the blood in the car, about her claims regarding a missing baby. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in his small notebook. "You said she mentioned a red barn?" Whitfield asked. "That's right. Said they went toward the red barn. But Sheriff, there must be 50 red barns in this county." "More than that," Whitfield agreed, "and most of them are snowed in right now. We can't exactly launch a search with conditions like this, especially for a baby that might not exist." The word stung, but Marcus understood the sheriff's position. Resources were limited, the weather was still dangerous, and they had no proof that a child was actually missing. But something in the woman's eyes, the desperation in her voice when she'd grabbed his arm, convinced him that she wasn't hallucinating. Dr. Foster emerged from the treatment room, pulling off her latex gloves. She's stable for now, but still critical. The warming process has to be slow, or we risk cardiac arrest. It'll be hours before she's conscious enough for questioning. Any identification? Sheriff Whitfield asked. Nothing. No purse, no wallet, no phone. Whoever she is, she wasn't carrying anything when Mr. Brennan found her. Marcus thought about the tire tracks on his property, about the timing of the storm, about the terror in the woman's voice. Somewhere out there, if she was telling the truth, a baby was missing in sub-zero temperatures. Every hour that passed made survival less likely. "Sheriff," he said, "I know you think she might be confused, but what if she isn't? What if there really is a child out there?" Whitfield sighed and looked out the window at the blowing snow. "Then God help us all, because we might already be too late." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As if summoned by his words, the lights in the hospital flickered, and the building shuddered under another gust of wind. The storm was far from over, and somewhere in the vast white wilderness of Cascade County, the truth was waiting to be discovered. The woman in the hospital bed stirred, her lips moving silently. Marcus leaned closer and caught a single word, whispered like a prayer. Dylan. The woman's name was Elena Vasquez, and she wasn't from Montana. Marcus discovered this 3 hours later when Sheriff Whitfield returned to the hospital with a folder full of paperwork and a grim expression. The sheriff had spent the afternoon running the car's license plates and checking missing person reports from neighboring states. "Vehicles registered to a Jessica Martinez in Denver," Whitfield said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Marcus in the waiting room. "But get this, Jessica Martinez reported the car stolen 2 days ago, said someone broke into her garage and took it while she was at work." So Elena stole the car? Maybe. Or maybe whoever took her baby also stole the car. We found her fingerprints in the system. She's got a record in Colorado. Shoplifting mostly, small stuff. Last known address was a women's shelter in Boulder. Dr. Foster appeared in the doorway, still wearing her scrubs. She's awake and asking for water. Body temperature is up to 94 degrees, which is progress. But she's still not out of danger. You can talk to her, but keep it brief. Elena Vasquez looked even younger in the harsh hospital lighting. Her dark hair was matted against the pillow, and her hands were wrapped in thick bandages to treat the frostbite. When she saw Marcus, her eyes filled with tears. "You saved me," she whispered. "Thank you." Sheriff Whitfield pulled out his notebook. "Miss Vasquez, I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Can you tell me about the baby you mentioned?" Elena's face crumpled. "Dylan, my son Dylan, he's 8 months old. They took him from the car seat. I tried to fight them, but there were 2 of them, and I was so scared." "Who took him? Can you describe them?" "2 men. One was tall, maybe 40 years old, with a beard. The other was younger, thin, with tattoos on his hands. They had a truck, a big black truck with chains on the tires." Marcus leaned forward. "Elena, when did this happen? Where were you when they took Dylan?" "Tuesday night, I think. We were driving north from Denver. Dylan was crying and I pulled over to feed him. That's when they stopped behind us. At first I thought they were trying to help, but then the tall one broke the back window and grabbed Dylan's car seat." "Why were you driving north in a storm?" Whitfield asked. Elena looked away. "I was running. My ex-boyfriend, Carlos, found me at the shelter. He said he was going to take Dylan away from me, said I wasn't fit to be a mother. I got scared and left. I thought if I could get to Canada, maybe cross the border, we'd be safe. In a stolen car. I didn't steal it. A woman at the shelter, Maria, gave me the keys, said it belonged to her sister and I could borrow it. I didn't know it was stolen. Marcus exchanged glances with the sheriff. The story was becoming more complicated by the minute. Elena, Marcus said gently, you mentioned a red barn. Do you remember anything else about where they went? After they took Dylan, they left me on the road. I tried to follow their truck, but the snow was so bad I could barely see. I walked for hours, I think. Everything looked the same, just white everywhere. But I saw lights in the distance, and there was a building, red with a metal roof. The truck went that direction. How far from where your car went off the road? I don't know. Miles, maybe. I was so cold and I kept falling down. I thought I was going to die. Dr. Foster stepped forward. That's enough for now. She needs rest. But Elena grabbed Marcus's hand as he started to leave. Please, you have to find him. Dylan needs his medicine. He has asthma, and without his inhaler. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. An 8-month-old baby with asthma, somewhere in the Montana wilderness, in the hands of kidnappers, who had no reason to keep him alive. Outside the hospital, the storm had intensified again. The parking lot was barely visible through the swirling snow, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. We need to organize a search, Marcus said. If that baby is still alive— With what? Whitfield interrupted. Half my deputies can't get to work because of the roads. Search and rescue is dealing with 3 separate emergencies, and we don't even know where to look. Red Barn could be anywhere in a 100-square-mile area. What about the state police? The FBI? Already called them. FBI won't get involved unless there's evidence of interstate trafficking, and the state boys are stretched thin. We're on our own until this weather breaks. Marcus stared out at the storm, thinking about Dylan Vasquez. 8 months old, possibly. Sick, definitely cold. No baby could survive long in these conditions. I'm going to search anyway, he said finally. Marcus, that's suicide. You'll get lost out there and freeze to death, just like the girl almost did. Then come with me. You know this county better than anyone. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow pile up against the hospital windows. There's something else, he said finally. I ran Elena's story through the databases. Her ex-boyfriend, Carlos Mendoza, has a record. Assault, drug dealing, and get this, he was arrested last month for trying to sell information about undocumented immigrants to ICE agents. You think he's involved? Could be. Or maybe Elena's running from more than just an abusive boyfriend. Either way, someone wanted that baby badly enough to snatch him in the middle of a blizzard. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Human trafficking. It's possible. There's been chatter about a network operating out of the northern states, moving people and other things across the Canadian border. Babies are worth a lot of money to the right buyers. The implications were horrifying. If Dylan had been taken by human traffickers, he could already be across the border, sold to buyers who would never be found. But something Elena had said nagged at Marcus. The detail about the Red Barn, the certainty in her voice when she'd described it. Sheriff, how many red barns are there between here and the Canadian border? Dozens, maybe more. Why? Elena was specific about the direction. She saw lights, saw the truck heading that way. If we map out all the red barns north of where I found her, maybe we can narrow it down. Whitfield pulled out his phone and opened a mapping application. Even if we could identify every red barn in a 50-mile radius, we don't have the manpower to check them all. And in this weather, we don't need to check them all, just the ones that make sense. Remote locations, places where someone could hide a kidnapped baby without being noticed. Despite his skepticism, Whitfield found himself nodding. There's the old Henderson place about 30 miles north of here. Red Barn, isolated, been empty since the family moved to Billings. And the Morrison Ranch has that big red equipment shed visible from the county road. What about the Kowalski farm? They've got that red dairy barn, and I heard they were having Financial trouble. The Kowalskis are good people, Marcus. They wouldn't. Desperate people do desperate things. Whitfield closed his phone and looked out at the storm. This is insane. We're talking about driving around in a blizzard, checking random barns, hoping to find kidnappers who might not even exist. That baby exists. Elena didn't imagine him. How do you know? Marcus thought about the terror in Elena's eyes. The way she'd grabbed his arm, the desperation in her voice when she'd whispered Dylan's name. Because she's a mother, and mothers don't forget their children, even when they're dying. The sheriff was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks against the possibility that a baby was dying somewhere in the cold. Finally, he sighed and pulled out his keys. If we're going to do this, we do it smart. We take radios, extra fuel, and emergency supplies, and we stick together. I'm not losing anyone else to this storm. They spent the next hour gathering equipment. From the sheriff's office, flares, blankets, first aid supplies, a thermos of coffee, and Marcus's hunting rifle. The radio crackled with reports from other deputies, more accidents, power outages, and a structure fire that the volunteer fire department couldn't reach because of the snow. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Foster called with an update on Elena's condition. She's stable, but she keeps asking about her baby. I gave her a mild sedative, but she's fighting it. She wants to help with the search. Tell her we're doing everything we can, Marcus said. And doctor, if she remembers anything at all, call me immediately. The drive north from town was treacherous. Even with chains and four-wheel drive, Whitfield's patrol car slipped and slid on the icy roads. The first location they checked was the Henderson place, but the old farmhouse was clearly abandoned. The red barn partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The Morrison Ranch was their second stop. Marcus knew Jake Morrison from cattle auctions, and the man seemed genuinely surprised to see them. He invited them in for coffee and listened to their story with growing concern. Haven't seen any strangers around here, Morrison said, but with the storm, someone could be hiding in any of the outbuildings, and I might not notice. You're welcome to check. They spent 20 minutes searching Morrison's property, but found nothing except cattle huddled against the wind and snow that had drifted against the barn doors. Their third stop was the most promising and the most dangerous. The Kowalski farm sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that hadn't been plowed in days. Whitfield's patrol car got stuck twice, and they had to dig themselves out with the emergency shovel. By the time they reached the farmhouse, it was nearly midnight, and the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The house was dark, but smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus could see the red dairy barn about 100 yards behind the main building, and there were tire tracks in the snow leading to it, fresh tracks that hadn't been completely filled by the storm. Something's not right, Whitfield muttered, checking his service weapon. The Kowalskis usually have their porch light on. They approached the house carefully, noting that the windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked any view inside. When Whitfield knocked on the front door, the sound echoed strangely, as if the house were mostly empty. No one answered. They walked around to the back, following the tire tracks toward the red barn. The snow crunched under their boots, and Marcus could hear his own heartbeat over the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, a baby might be crying for his mother. That's when they heard it. The unmistakable sound of an infant's wail carried on the wind from the direction of the barn. Marcus broke into a run, his boots slipping on the icy ground. Behind him, Sheriff Whitfield shouted something he couldn't hear over the wind and his own labored breathing. The barn door was closed but not locked. Marcus yanked it open and stepped inside, Sheriff's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 car seats were lined up against the far wall, each one occupied by a small child. In the nearest seat, an infant in a blue blanket was crying with the desperate intensity of hunger and fear. The other 2 children, slightly older, sat quietly, too quietly. Jesus Christ. Whitfield whispered behind him. But Marcus was already moving toward the crying baby, his heart hammering with the certainty that they had found Dylan Vasquez. The infant looked up at him with large, dark eyes that were unmistakably his mother's. "It's okay," Marcus whispered, his hands shaking as he unbuckled the car seat. "We're going to take you home." That's when the barn door slammed shut behind them, and they heard the sound of a heavy bar sliding into place. They were trapped. The darkness inside the barn was absolute. Marcus clutched Dylan against his chest, feeling the baby's rapid heartbeat through the thin blanket. Sheriff Whitfield's flashlight had gone out when the door slammed shut, leaving them blind in the freezing air. "Whitfield, you okay?" Marcus whispered. "Yeah, but my radio's dead. Must have damaged it when I hit the ground." The sheriff's voice came from somewhere to Marcus's left. "Can you reach your phone?" Marcus shifted Dylan to one arm and fumbled for his cell phone. The screen provided a weak blue glow, but showed no signal bars. Nothing. We're too far from the tower. Outside, they could hear voices. At least 2 men, maybe more. The words were muffled by the wind and the thick barn walls, but the tone was clearly agitated. Someone was arguing about what to do next. "We need to get these kids out of here," Marcus said, moving carefully toward where he remembered seeing the other car seats. His phone's dim light revealed 2 more children, a girl who looked about 2 years old and a boy slightly older, maybe 3. Both were awake, but silent, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. "How many are there?" Whitfield asked, his voice tight with rage. 3 total, Dylan and 2 others. Marcus knelt beside the girl's car seat. She was wrapped in a pink blanket, her dark hair matted with tears. "Hey, sweetie, it's okay. We're here to help." The girl didn't respond, but her eyes tracked his movements. Marcus had seen that look before, the hollow stare of a child who had learned that crying brought no comfort. Whitfield was moving around the barn, using his hands to map the walls. "There's got to be another way out. Back door, window, something." Marcus picked up Dylan and the little girl, one in each arm. "Can you carry the boy?" "Got him." Whitfield's voice was strained. "Marcus, these kids are drugged. Look at their eyes. Pupils are dilated, and they're too calm for this situation." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Whoever was running this operation was keeping the children sedated, probably to make them easier to transport. The thought of Dylan being given drugs made his stomach twist with fury. "How long do we have before they come in here?" Marcus asked. "Not long. They're probably calling for backup or deciding whether to cut their losses and run." Whitfield found his way to Marcus's side. "We need to—" The conversation outside suddenly stopped. In the silence, Marcus could hear the crunch of footsteps in the snow, circling the barn. Then a new voice, older and more authoritative than the others. "I don't care what you saw. We stick to the plan, load the truck and get them to the border. We can deal with the witnesses later." "What about the cop car?" This was a younger voice, nervous. "We'll handle it. Make it look like they got lost in—" "The storm froze to death looking for shelter. Happens all the time out here." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. They weren't just dealing with kidnappers, they were dealing with killers who had obviously done this before. Whitfield grabbed his arm. "Back corner of the barn. I found something." They moved as quietly as possible through the darkness, the children silent in their arms. Marcus used his phone's light sparingly, afraid the glow might be visible through cracks in the barn walls. "Here," Whitfield whispered. "It's a root cellar. The door's hidden under some old hay bales." Marcus felt around until his fingers found the edge of a wooden trapdoor. It was heavy but not locked. "Where does it lead?" "Don't know, but it's our only chance. You go first with the kids. I'll cover the door." "Tom, if they come in here, then you better move fast." Marcus lowered himself through the trapdoor, still holding Dylan and the little girl. The space below was cramped and smelled of earth and old vegetables, but it was warmer than the barn. He set the children down on what felt like a dirt floor, then reached up to help Whitfield lower the boy. "I'm going to try to create a distraction," Whitfield said. "Give you time to get the kids out of here." "How? We don't even know where this tunnel leads. It's got to come out somewhere, probably near the house. Most of these old farms have root cellars that connect to the kitchen." From above, they heard the sound of the barn door being unbarred. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized they had maybe seconds before the kidnappers discovered the children were missing. "Go," Whitfield hissed. "Now!" Marcus gathered the children and began moving through the tunnel. It was narrow and low, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees while carrying Dylan. The little girl followed behind him, her small hand gripping his ankle. The boy was eerily quiet, his movements sluggish from whatever drugs they'd given him. Behind them, Marcus heard shouting from the barn. Whitfield's voice rose above the others, and then came the sound of a gunshot. Marcus froze, his heart stopping. "Tom?" Silence. He forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping would mean death for all of them. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally he saw a faint light ahead, not electric light, but the grey glow of dawn filtering through a crack. The tunnel ended at another wooden door, this one at ground level. Marcus pushed it open cautiously and found himself in the basement of the Kowalski farmhouse. The basement was empty, except for an old furnace and some storage boxes, but he could hear voices from the floor above. "Where are they?" a man was shouting. "3 kids don't just disappear." "Maybe they were never here," another voice replied. "Maybe the Mexican girl was lying." The car seats were there. Someone took them. Marcus held Dylan close and motioned for the other children to stay quiet. The little girl seemed to understand, pressing herself against his leg. The boy swayed on his feet, still heavily sedated. Above them, footsteps pounded across the floor. Marcus counted at least 3 different sets of feet, maybe 4. Through the basement window, he could see the barn in the distance, its door standing open. There was no sign of Sheriff Whitfield. "We need to search the area," the authoritative voice said. "They can't have gone far in this weather." "What about the cop?" "Dead. Resisted arrest." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tom Whitfield had been his friend for 15 years, had been best man at Marcus's wedding, had helped him through the divorce. Now he was dead, killed trying to save 3 children he'd never met. Marcus looked at Dylan, at the little girl clinging to his leg, at the drugged boy who could barely stand. Whitfield had died to give them a chance to escape, and Marcus wasn't going to waste it. He found a door that led to the main floor and listened carefully. The voices had moved outside. The kidnappers obviously searching the area around the barn. This was his chance, maybe his only one. The farmhouse kitchen was empty, but showed signs of recent use. Dirty dishes in the sink, empty beer bottles on the counter, the smell of cigarette smoke. Marcus crept to the front window and peered out. 3 men were standing near the barn, gesturing and arguing. One of them was holding a rifle, but where were the Kowalskis? Had they been killed, or were they part of this operation? Marcus got his answer when he heard a muffled cry from somewhere in the house. He followed the sound to a back bedroom where he found an elderly couple tied to chairs, duct tape over their mouths. Their eyes went wide when they saw him. "It's okay," he whispered, setting Dylan down long enough to cut their bonds with a kitchen knife. "I'm going to get you out of here." The woman, who Marcus recognized as Helen Kowalski, immediately reached for Dylan. "Oh my God, what have they done to these babies?" "Helen, we need to get out of here now," Marcus said. "How many of them are there?" "4, her husband Frank replied, his voice hoarse. "They showed up yesterday, said they needed to use our barn for a few days. When we refused, they tied us up." "Do you have a car that runs?" "Old pickup truck in the garage. Keys are on the hook by the door." Marcus looked out the window again. The men were still searching near the barn, but one of them was starting to walk back toward the house. They had maybe 2 minutes. "We go out the back," he said. "Helen, can you carry Dylan? Frank, help me with the other kids." They moved through the house as quietly as possible. The little girl was walking now, holding onto Frank's hand, but the boy needed to be carried. Marcus could hear voices getting closer to the front door. The garage was attached to the house, accessible through a small mudroom. Frank's pickup truck was an ancient Ford, but it started on the first try. Marcus put the children in the cab, while Helen climbed into the driver's seat. "I'll drive," she said firmly. "I know these roads better than anyone." "Helen, it's too dangerous. Those men killed my neighbor, Tom Whitfield. They terrorized my family and kidnapped these babies. I'm driving." Marcus couldn't argue with the steel in her voice. He climbed into the passenger seat, holding Dylan while Frank squeezed in beside them with the other children. Helen backed out of the garage just as the front door of the house burst open. One of the men saw them and shouted to the others. Marcus heard gunshots as Helen gunned the engine and spun the truck around. "Hold on," she said grimly, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The old pickup truck had chains on the tires and a heavy engine that cut through the snow like a plow. Helen drove with the skill of someone who'd spent 70 years navigating Montana winters, taking turns that would have been impossible for most drivers. Behind them, Marcus could see headlights following. The kidnappers had vehicles of their own, and they were closing the distance. "There's a side road about 2 miles ahead," Helen said. "Cuts through Morrison Place. If we can get there before they catch us." A bullet shattered the rear window, and Frank cursed under his breath. The little girl began to cry, the first sound she'd made since they found her. "It's okay, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice remarkably calm. "We're almost home." But Marcus knew they weren't home yet. The kidnappers were still behind them, and the storm was getting worse. Even if they made it to the side road, they'd still have to get to town, to safety, to help. Dylan stirred in his arms, his small hand grasping at Marcus's shirt. The baby's eyes were clearer now, the drugs apparently wearing off. He looked up at Marcus with an expression that seemed almost grateful. "Your mama's waiting for you," Marcus whispered. "We're going to take you home." Another gunshot rang out, this one closer. Helen took a sharp turn onto the side road, and Marcus felt the truck slide sideways before the chains caught and pulled them forward. They were still alive, still moving, still fighting. But the real test was yet to come. In the distance, Marcus could see the lights of Cascade General Hospital, where Elena Vasquez was waiting for news of her son. He thought about Sheriff Whitfield, about the sacrifice that had made this escape possible. The truck hit a pothole and jarred them all, but Helen kept driving. In the rearview mirror, the headlights were falling behind. Maybe they were going to make it after all. That's when Marcus saw the roadblock ahead. Part 4. The roadblock wasn't what Marcus expected. Instead of police cars with flashing lights, 2 black SUVs sat perpendicular across the county road, their engines running and headlights creating a wall of white light through the blowing snow. Men in dark clothing stood behind the vehicles, and Marcus caught the glint of weapons in their hands. "That's not the police," Helen said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's them," Frank replied grimly. They called ahead. Set up. An ambush. Marcus felt Dylan trembling in his arms. The baby was fully awake now, his eyes bright with fever. Without his asthma medication, every breath was a struggle, and each labored wheeze made Marcus's chest tighten with urgency. "Turn around," Marcus said. "Can't. They're behind us too." Marcus twisted in his seat and saw headlights approaching from their rear. They were trapped between 2 groups of kidnappers, on a road that offered no escape routes through the deep snow on either side. Helen slowed the truck, but didn't stop. "There's an old logging road about a 1/4 mile ahead. If I can get us there." Before they start shooting, "Helen, this truck won't make it through forest roads in this weather. It will if I drive it right." The woman's determination reminded Marcus why rural people survived in places that killed others. Helen Kowalski had spent 7 decades dealing with Montana winters, and she wasn't about to let some city criminals stop her now. The men at the roadblock were gesturing, clearly expecting them to stop. One of them stepped into the road, holding up his hand. Helen aimed the truck directly at him. "Hold tight," she said. The man dove out of the way as Helen gunned the engine. The old Ford crashed through the gap between the SUVs, its reinforced bumper scraping against metal. Gunshots erupted behind them, and Marcus heard bullets punching through the truck's tailgate. "Everyone down!" he shouted, pushing the children toward the floor. Helen kept her foot on the accelerator, the truck fishtailing on the icy road. In the side mirror, Marcus saw the SUVs spinning around to follow them. Their pursuers had more powerful vehicles, but Helen knew every curve and dip in this road. "There," she said, yanking the wheel hard to the right. The logging road was barely visible, just a gap in the trees marked by 2 rusted posts. Helen took the turn without slowing, and the truck plunged into the forest. Snow-laden branches scraped against the windows as they bounced along what was more of a trail than a road. "Where does this go?" Marcus asked, checking Dylan's breathing. The baby's lips were beginning to turn blue. "Comes out near the old mining camp, about 10 miles from here." "But Marcus, that baby needs help. He's not getting enough air." Dylan's wheezing was getting worse. Marcus had seen asthma attacks before, and this one was severe. Without medical intervention, the child could die within hours. "How far is the mining camp?" "In this weather? An hour, maybe more." They didn't have an hour. Behind them, Marcus could see headlights bouncing through the trees. The SUVs were following, their drivers pushing hard despite the treacherous conditions. "Frank, is there anywhere else we can go? Somewhere with people, with help?" The old man was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's a ranger station about 5 miles up this road. Should be someone there, even in the storm." Should it be? Rangers are supposed to maintain a presence during emergencies. But Marcus? "I haven't seen lights at that station in weeks." It was their only option. Helen navigated the truck through a series of switchbacks, the engine laboring in the deep snow. The little girl had fallen asleep against Frank's shoulder, but the boy was still awake, his drugged eyes tracking the movement of the trees outside. "What are their names?" Marcus asked, looking at the other children. "I don't know," Frank replied. "Those men never said." But the girl had this. He pulled a small stuffed rabbit from his coat pocket, found it in the barn, has a name tag, Sophia. Sophia, 3 years old, kidnapped and drugged, hundreds of miles from home. Marcus wondered how many other children had passed through that. Red Barn. How many families were still searching for missing sons and daughters? Dylan coughed, a harsh sound that made Marcus's heart race. The baby's breathing was becoming more labored, his small chest working hard with each breath. "We need to stop," Marcus said. "He's getting worse." "If we stop, they'll catch us," Helen replied. "Those SUVs are built for this terrain. We stop, we all die." She was right, but watching Dylan struggle to breathe was torture. Marcus pulled the blanket tighter around the baby and tried to remember everything he knew about asthma. Keep the child calm, keep them warm, and get medical help as quickly as possible. The truck hit a particularly rough patch of road, and everyone bounced against the ceiling. Dylan started crying, the sound weak and breathless. Sophia woke up and began whimpering, reaching for her stuffed rabbit. "Almost there," Helen said, though Marcus could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The ranger station appeared through the trees like a mirage, a small log building with a stone chimney, snow piled against its walls. But the windows were dark, and no smoke rose from the chimney. "Looks abandoned," Frank said. Helen parked the truck behind the building, out of sight from the logging road. "We check anyway. Maybe there's a radio, medical supplies, something." They left the truck running for heat and approached the ranger station cautiously. The front door was locked, but Frank found a window that opened. Marcus climbed through first, then helped the others inside. The station was small but functional. A main room with a desk and radio equipment, a back room with supplies and a bathroom. Marcus went straight to the radio, hoping to raise someone, anyone who could help. The radio was dead. No power, no signal, nothing. "Generators out back," Frank said. "If we can get it started." While Frank went to check the generator, Marcus searched the supply room. He found first aid kits, emergency food, and blankets, but nothing for treating asthma. His frustration mounted as Dylan's breathing became increasingly desperate. "Helen, is there anything else around here? Another building? A camp, anything? Mining camp's still 5 miles up the mountain. But Marcus, that road's worse than this one. In this storm we might not make it." Outside, Marcus heard the distant sound of engines. Their pursuers had found the logging road. Frank burst through the front door, his face grim. "Generators busted! Looks like it's been sabotaged. Fuel lines cut, engine damaged. Someone didn't want this place operational." The implications were chilling. The kidnapping operation wasn't just random. It was organized, with people who knew the area well enough to disable emergency facilities. "They're coming," Helen said, peering through a window. "I can see lights on the road." Marcus looked at Dylan, whose lips were now definitely blue. The baby was fighting for every breath, his small body exhausted from the effort. They couldn't run anymore, and they couldn't stay here. "There's one more option," Frank said quietly. "The old mine shaft about a 1/4 mile from here. It's deep, warm, and there are supplies cached down there from when the rescue teams used it as a base camp." "What kind of supplies?" "Medical equipment, oxygen tanks, radio gear. The mine company left everything when they shut down operations. It was a desperate gamble, but Dylan was dying." Marcus wrapped the baby in fresh blankets and gathered the other children. "How do we get there?" "On foot. There's a trail behind. The station, marked with reflective tags. But in this weather, we don't have a choice." Helen found emergency packs in the ranger station. Flashlights, flares, emergency food. Frank located snowshoes that were too big but better than nothing. Marcus fashioned a sling to carry Dylan against his chest, keeping the baby warm and protected. They left through the back window just as headlights swept across the front of the building. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding through dense forest where the snow had drifted to waist height. Marcus led the way, following the faint reflective markers that glinted in his flashlight beam. Sophia walked bravely between Helen and Frank, but the drugged boy needed to be carried. They took turns, switching off every few hundred yards. The cold was brutal, and Marcus could feel the strength draining from his legs with each step. Behind them, they could hear shouts and see flashlight beams cutting through the trees. The kidnappers had found the ranger station and were following their trail. "How much farther?" Marcus asked, his breath coming in short puffs. "Just ahead," Frank replied. "Should be right around this bend." The mine entrance was almost invisible, just a dark opening in a rocky hillside, partially hidden by snow and fallen logs. A weathered sign warned of dangerous conditions, but Marcus could see that the entrance had been recently used. Footprints in the snow, tire tracks from some kind of vehicle. "Someone's been here," he said. "Rescue teams use it for training exercises," Helen explained. "It's safe as long as you don't go too deep." They hurried into the mine, and Marcus immediately felt the difference in temperature. The air was warmer. Here, protected from the wind, and he could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Frank's flashlight revealed a well-maintained tunnel with wooden supports and electric cables running along the walls. About 50 yards in, they found what they were looking for, a cache of emergency supplies left by the rescue teams. Medical equipment, oxygen tanks, radios, food, and blankets were stored in waterproof containers. Marcus found a portable oxygen concentrator and quickly figured out how to operate it. He placed the small mask over Dylan's face, and within minutes, The baby's breathing began to improve. "Thank God," Helen whispered. Marcus tried the radio equipment, but the mine blocked most signals. However, one of the radios was powerful enough to reach the emergency frequency, and after several attempts, he raised a dispatcher in Billings. "This is Marcus Brennan. I'm reporting the murder of Sheriff Tom Whitfield and a kidnapping operation in Cascade County. We have 3 kidnapped children who need immediate medical attention." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static. "Mr. Brennan, we've been looking for you. State Police and FBI are en route to your location. Can you provide coordinates?" Marcus gave their approximate location and described the situation. The dispatcher confirmed that a helicopter was being prepared, weather permitting, and that ground units were already moving toward the area. "Help is coming," he told the others. But outside the mine, flashlight beams were approaching. The kidnappers had followed their trail and were closing in. Marcus heard voices arguing about whether to enter the mine. "Seal them in," one voice said. "Bring down the entrance and let them freeze. We take our losses and get out of here." Marcus's blood ran cold. If they brought down the mine entrance, no one would find them until spring, if ever. "We need to go deeper," he said. "Find another way out." "Marcus, these mines go for miles underground," Frank warned. "We could get lost down there." Better lost than buried alive. They gathered the essential supplies: oxygen for Dylan, medical kit, water, and one of the radios. Marcus led the way deeper into the mine, following the main tunnel that seemed to slope gradually downward. Behind them, they heard the sound of explosions. The explosions shook dust from the mine ceiling and sent rocks tumbling behind them. Marcus felt the ground vibrate under his feet as he carried Dylan deeper into the tunnel, the baby's oxygen mask fogging with each small breath. The portable concentrator hummed quietly, its battery indicator showing 3 hours of power remaining. "The whole entrance is gone," Frank said, looking back at the wall of debris that now blocked their escape route. "We're sealed in." Helen adjusted the emergency pack on her shoulders, her face grim but determined. "Then we find another way out. These old mines usually have multiple shafts." Sophia walked between them, clutching her stuffed rabbit and staying close to Helen's legs. The drugged boy was more alert now, the medication apparently wearing off, but he still needed Frank's help to navigate the uneven tunnel floor. Marcus checked his flashlight battery and realized they had a serious problem. Even with the emergency supplies they'd gathered, they had limited light sources and no idea how extensive the mine system was. Getting lost down here would be a death sentence. "Frank, you said rescue teams use these tunnels for training. What do you know about the layout?" "Not much. I know there are at least 3 levels, and somewhere down here is an underground lake. The mining company used to pump water out of it, but when they abandoned the operation..." His voice trailed off as they reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 directions. Marcus shined his light down each passage, but they all looked identical. Rough-hewn rock walls supported by rotting timber disappearing into darkness. "We need to mark our path," Helen said, pulling colored chalk from the emergency kit. "My grandfather was a miner. He always said the most dangerous thing underground wasn't cave-ins or gas, it was getting turned around." Marcus made a chalk arrow pointing back toward the collapsed entrance, then chose the middle tunnel because it seemed to slope upward. Maybe it would lead to another surface opening. They walked for 20 minutes before the tunnel began to change. The walls became smoother, carved rather than blasted, and Marcus could see tool marks from hand drilling. This was older than the main shaft, probably from the original mining operation in the 1800s. "Look at this," Frank said, stopping beside a wooden sign that was barely legible. "Level 2, Copper Works." "There's a map." The faded diagram showed a complex network of tunnels, shafts, and chambers. Most importantly, it indicated 2 surface exits besides the main entrance, one marked Emergency Shaft North and another labeled Ventilation Shaft East. The emergency shaft is about half a mile that way, Helen said, pointing down a side tunnel. But it's marked with warning signs, probably unstable. What about the ventilation shaft? Closer, but it shows water damage. Could be flooded. Dylan stirred in Marcus's arms, making a soft sound that might have been contentment. The oxygen was helping, but Marcus could see that the baby was getting hungry and would need feeding soon. They had formula in the emergency supplies, but no way to warm it properly. "We try the ventilation shaft first," Marcus decided. "If it's blocked, we backtrack to the emergency exit." The tunnel to the ventilation shaft was different from the others, narrower and carved with precision that spoke of skilled craftsmen. Electric cables ran along the ceiling, though the power had been disconnected decades ago. Marcus's flashlight picked up something else, fresh boot prints in the dust. "Someone's been here recently," he said, stopping to examine the tracks. "These aren't rescue team boots. Wrong pattern." Helen knelt beside him, studying the prints. "Two different people, I'd say, one bigger than the other. And look here, they were carrying something heavy." The implications were disturbing. If the kidnappers knew about alternate routes through the mine, then sealing the main entrance might not have been intended to trap them. It might have been herding them toward another ambush. "We need to be more careful," Marcus said. "They might know we're coming." Frank found something else, scratches in the rock wall that looked deliberate. Someone's been marking these tunnels, recent scratches, not old mining marks. The ventilation shaft was still several hundred yards ahead when they heard it, the sound of machinery echoing through the stone corridors. "A generator running somewhere in the mine system. That's not rescue equipment," Helen whispered. "Too loud, wrong frequency." Marcus held up his hand for silence. The sound was coming from ahead of them, near where the ventilation shaft should be. Mixed with the generator noise, he could hear voices, men talking in low tones about schedules and logistics. "They're using the mine," he realized. "This isn't just about kidnapping those kids. It's a staging area for something bigger." Frank's face was pale in the flashlight beam. "Human trafficking." Elena was right. They're moving people across the border. The mine gives them a hidden route that bypasses all the official checkpoints. The pieces were falling into place. The Red Barn was just a temporary holding facility. The real operation was here, underground, where trucks could enter through one shaft and emerge miles away without ever being seen on the surface. Sophia tugged on Helen's coat and pointed down a side passage they hadn't noticed before. In the darkness, Marcus could see a faint glow, not electric light, but the grey illumination of daylight filtering down from above. "Natural chimney," Helen whispered. "Some of these old mines have vertical shafts that connect to caves or sinkholes on the surface. It was their best chance of escape, but they'd have to get past whatever operation the kidnappers were running near the ventilation shaft." Marcus checked Dylan's oxygen supply, still 2 hours remaining, and made a decision. "Helen, take the children up that shaft. See if you can get to the surface and signal for help. Frank and I will create a distraction." "Marcus, that's suicide. There could be a dozen men down here, and there are 3 children who need to get out alive. Dylan especially. He won't survive much longer without proper medical care." Helen looked at the baby in Marcus's arms, then at Sophia and the boy. "How will we find each other again?" "We won't. Your job is to get those kids to safety and bring back help. Mine is to make sure you have time to do it." Frank was already checking his pockets for anything that could be used as a weapon. "I've got a hunting knife and some flares. Not much against firearms. We don't need to fight them. We just need to cause enough chaos to cover Helen's escape." Marcus handed Dylan to Helen, his heart breaking as the baby looked up at him with trusting eyes. "Keep the oxygen mask on him. If you reach the surface, get to the hospital as fast as you can. Tell Dr. Foster what happened." "What about you?" "We'll find another way out." Helen kissed Marcus's forehead, then gathered the children. "Come on. Babies, we're going to see the sky." Marcus watched them disappear up the natural chimney, Sophia's stuffed rabbit the last thing visible in his flashlight beam. Then he and Frank began moving toward the source of the generator noise. The tunnel opened into a large chamber that had been carved out for heavy equipment. Marcus peered around the corner and felt his stomach drop. The space was full of activity. At least 8 men loading wooden crates onto a conveyor system that led to another tunnel. The crates were marked with shipping labels, but Marcus could see air holes drilled in the sides. "They're not just moving people," Frank whispered. "They're moving them like cargo." A truck was parked at the far end of the chamber, its engine, running and exhaust being vented through a flexible hose connected to the ventilation shaft. The license plate was Canadian, and Marcus realized they were looking at a border crossing operation that could move people invisibly between countries. One of the men was clearly in charge, tall, well-dressed, speaking into a satellite phone in accented English. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation. Shipment delayed, police interference, and clean up loose ends. "That's the man Elena described," Frank said. "The tall one with the beard." Marcus studied the setup, looking for weaknesses. The generator was positioned near some old mining equipment, fuel drums stacked nearby. If he could reach it without being seen... "Frank, you see that control panel near the conveyor? Think you could figure out how to reverse it?" "Maybe. Why?" "If we can jam their operation and start a fire, it'll create enough confusion for the authorities to track. That satellite phone signal can be traced, and smoke from the ventilation shaft will be visible for miles." It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. Marcus pulled out 2 of the emergency flares and handed one to Frank. "Wait for my signal. When I light the fuel drums, you hit that control panel and then run like hell." Frank gripped the flare tightly. "Marcus, it's been an honor knowing you. Save the eulogies. We're both getting out of this alive." Marcus began moving through the shadows along the chamber wall, using mining equipment as cover. The men were focused on their loading operation, shouting over the noise of the generator and conveyor system. He made it halfway to the fuel drums when someone spotted him. "Intruder, north wall." Gunshots echoed through the chamber as Marcus dove behind a mining cart. Bullets sparked off metal and stone around him. He lit the flare and threw it toward the fuel drums, praying his aim was accurate. The explosion was bigger than he'd expected. Flames erupted across half the chamber, and men scattered in all directions. Through the chaos, Marcus saw Frank reach the control panel and begin frantically pressing buttons. The conveyor system lurched, reversed direction, and began dumping crates onto the floor. Some of the containers broke open, and Marcus heard voices, terrified. People calling out in Spanish and other languages he didn't recognize. "The shipment!" the tall man shouted. "Save the shipment!" But the fire was spreading, fed by spilled fuel and old timber supports. Smoke was pouring into the ventilation shaft, and Marcus could hear the truck's engine revving as the driver tried to escape through the other tunnel. Frank appeared beside him, grinning despite the danger. "Time to go!" They ran back the way they had come, following Helen's chalk marks in reverse. Behind them, the fire continued to spread, and Marcus could hear more explosions as additional fuel caught fire. "The emergency shaft," Frank panted. "Our only way out now." But when they reached the junction, Marcus stopped. "Frank, those people in the crates, we can't just leave them." "Marcus, that whole section is going to collapse. We go back there, we die. And if we don't, they die." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're right, but we do this fast and smart, no heroes." They backtracked toward the burning chamber, following side tunnels to avoid the worst of the fire. The smoke was getting thicker, and Marcus could hear timber creaking ominously overhead. Near the edge of the chamber they found them, 6 people in various states of consciousness, huddled together after escaping from the broken crates. 2 women, 3 men, and a teenage boy, all showing signs of drugging and abuse. "Ayuda?" one of the women asked weakly. Policía? Sí, Marcus replied in his limited Spanish. Vamos, quickly. Getting 6 weak, disoriented people through narrow tunnels while the place was burning down around them was like something from a nightmare. Marcus and Frank took turns, carrying those who couldn't walk, following their chalk marks back toward the emergency shaft. The tunnel was getting hotter, and Marcus could hear the main support timbers beginning to fail. They had maybe minutes before the whole mine system started collapsing. There, Frank pointed ahead. I can see light. The emergency shaft was a vertical climb about 40 feet to the surface, with a rusty ladder attached to the rock wall. It would be slow going with injured people, but it was their only chance. Marcus sent the strongest victims up first, then helped Frank boost the others onto the ladder. The teenage boy was unconscious and had to be carried, which meant someone would have to make multiple trips. You go, Frank said. I'll bring up the rear. Do we go together or not at all? But before Frank could argue, they heard the sound they'd been dreading, a deep rumbling as tons of rock and timber began to collapse somewhere behind them. The mine was coming down, and they were still 40 feet underground. The ladder shook violently as another section of the mine collapsed behind them. Marcus could feel the vibrations through the metal rungs as he climbed, carrying the unconscious teenage boy on his back. Above him, one of the women was struggling to maintain her grip, her hands still numb from whatever drugs she'd been given. "Keep climbing!" Frank shouted from below. "Don't look down!" The shaft was narrower than Marcus had hoped, barely wide, enough for one person at a time. Loose rock rained down from above as the surface opening shifted and settled. If the shaft collapsed while they were climbing, they'd be crushed or buried alive. 20 feet from the surface, the woman above Marcus lost her grip. He pressed himself against the ladder as she fell past him, but Frank was ready. The older man caught her with one arm, while maintaining his hold on the ladder with the other, his strength remarkable for someone his age. "I've got her," Frank called. "Keep going." But the boy on Marcus's back was dead weight, and Marcus's arms were burning with fatigue. Each rung felt like it took forever, and the sounds of destruction below were getting closer. He could smell smoke now, acrid and thick, pouring up through the shaft. 10 feet from the top, Marcus could see Helen's face peering down at them. She was lying flat on the snow, reaching down to help pull people up. Behind her, Dylan was crying, a sound that had never been more beautiful to Marcus's ears. "Almost there," Helen called. "I can see FBI helicopters in the distance." Marcus pushed himself up the final rungs and rolled onto the snowy ground, still carrying the teenage boy. The cold air felt like a gift after the smoke and heat of the mine. Around them, the other rescued victims were huddled together, wrapped in emergency blankets that Helen must have found in her pack. Frank emerged from the shaft, carrying the woman who'd fallen, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Is everyone out?" he asked. Marcus did a quick count, 6 trafficking victims, plus the 3 children they'd originally rescued. Sophia was sitting quietly beside Helen, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, while the other boy was finally showing signs of alertness as the drugs wore off. "Where's Dylan?" Marcus asked. "Right here," Helen said, lifting the baby from a makeshift bed she'd created using emergency blankets. "His breathing is much better. The oxygen helped, and being in the cold air seems to have reduced the swelling in his airways." Marcus took Dylan in his arms, relief flooding through him as the baby looked up with clear, bright eyes. "Hey there, little guy. Your mama's going to be so happy to see you." The sound of helicopters was getting louder, and Marcus could see them. Now, 2 FBI choppers approaching from the south, their rotors cutting through the falling snow. But there was another sound too, the rumble of heavy engines approaching on the ground. "Company," Frank said grimly. 3 black SUVs were racing across the snowy field toward them, the same vehicles they'd encountered at the roadblock. The kidnappers weren't giving up, even with federal agents inbound. "Get everyone to those trees," Marcus said, pointing to a stand of pines about 50 yards away. "The helicopters can't land here with those vehicles approaching." Helen organized the victims while Marcus and Frank provided cover. The trafficking survivors were weak but determined, helping each other stumble through the snow toward the tree line. Sophia walked beside one of the women, her small hand holding the woman's much larger one in a gesture of mutual comfort. The SUVs reached the mine opening just as the FBI helicopters came into range. Marcus could see the vehicles stopping, men jumping out with weapons. Some were trying to block the helicopter landing zone, while others were advancing toward the trees. "Federal agents!" a voice boomed from one of the helicopters through a loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The response was immediate gunfire. The kidnappers opened up with automatic weapons, forcing the helicopters to pull back and circle. Marcus realized the federal agents couldn't land with hostile fire coming from the ground. "We need to neutralize those shooters," Frank said. "Otherwise, this standoff could go on for hours." "With what? We've got a hunting knife and one emergency flare." Frank smiled grimly and pulled something from his coat pocket, a small device that looked like a garage door opener. "Remember how I said the generator was sabotaged? Well, I might have done a little sabotaging of my own while we were down there." "What is that?" "Remote detonator for the rest of their fuel supplies. When I was at the control panel, I rigged the remaining drums with flares and timer devices. This should set them all off at once." Marcus stared at him. "You turned the whole mine into a bomb." "Just the parts they were using for trafficking. The explosion should collapse their tunnel system and cut off any escape routes. Plus, it'll distract them long enough for the FBI to land." The plan was insane, but it might work. Marcus looked back at the group huddled in the trees. 9 victims who deserved justice, 3 children who needed to go home. Sometimes insane was exactly what the situation required. "Do it," he said. Frank pressed the button. The explosion was visible before the sound reached them. The ground erupted near the mine entrance, sending flames and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave knocked several of the kidnappers off their feet and shattered the windows of their vehicles. In the confusion, the FBI helicopters swooped in. Armed agents rappelled down ropes, establishing a perimeter around the kidnappers before they could recover. Within minutes, the gunfire stopped, and the loudspeaker was announcing arrests. Marcus watched as federal agents secured the scene, his arms wrapped around Dylan. The baby was sleeping now, his breathing steady and normal. For the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself to believe they were actually safe. Special Agent Sarah Chen approached through the snow, no relation to Marcus's neighbor, despite sharing a name. She was young, but moved with the confidence of someone who'd handled cases like this before. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Agent Chen, FBI Human Trafficking Task Force. We need to debrief you and get these victims to medical care." "The baby needs to get to his mother," Marcus said. "Elena Vasquez, she's at Cascade General Hospital, and these other children. We're already coordinating with local authorities." "Elena Vasquez has been asking about her son every hour since she was admitted. Dr. Foster says she's stable enough to be reunited with him." Agent Chen began interviewing the trafficking victims, speaking Spanish fluently with those who couldn't communicate in English. Marcus learned that they'd been kidnapped from various locations across the Southwest, some as far away as Arizona and New Mexico. "This network has been operating for over 2 years," Agent Chen explained to Marcus. "They use rural locations like this mine to move people invisibly across the border. We estimate they've trafficked over 200 individuals." "What about the children?" "Sophia and the boy?" "Sophia Martinez was taken from a playground in El Paso 3 weeks ago. The boy is Kevin Walsh. He was abducted from a shopping mall in Denver 5 days ago. Both families have been notified that their children are safe." Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. These weren't just nameless victims. They were real people with families who'd been searching for them, praying for their return. Frank was being interviewed by another agent, describing the mine layout and the trafficking operation they'd discovered. The whole system was sophisticated, he was saying. Trucks could enter through one shaft and emerge miles away without ever being seen from the surface. We'll need to map the entire tunnel network, the agent replied. Make sure we didn't miss any other victims or escape routes. Helen was sitting with Sophia, who had finally started talking. The little girl was telling Helen about her mama and papa, about her dog named Pancho, about how scared she'd been in the dark barn. I want to go home, Sophia said in a small voice. You are going home, sweetheart, Helen replied. Very soon. The helicopter ride to Cascade General Hospital took 15 minutes. Marcus sat beside Dylan's medical transport carrier, watching monitors that showed the baby's vital signs returning to normal. Dr. Foster met them at the helipad, her face breaking into a smile when she saw Dylan. Elena's been asking about him non-stop, she said. She kept saying his name in her sleep. Elena was awake when they brought Dylan into her room. She was still pale and weak from her ordeal, but when she saw her son, tears streamed down her face. Dylan, she whispered, reaching for him with trembling hands. Mi bébé. Marcus placed the baby in Elena's arms and stepped back, watching as mother and child were reunited. Dylan seemed to recognize his mother immediately, making soft cooing sounds and grasping at her hospital gown. Thank you, Elena said, looking up at Marcus. You brought him back to me. You saved him yourself, Marcus replied, by staying alive. Long enough to tell us where to look. Dr. Foster checked Dylan's breathing and pronounced him in good condition. The oxygen treatment worked perfectly. He should make a full recovery with no lasting effects. Agent Chen arrived an hour later with updates on the case. We've arrested 12 members of the trafficking network, including the ringleader you encountered in the mine. The Canadian authorities have been notified and are coordinating to shut down the receiving end of the operation. What about the people we rescued? All receiving medical care and psychological support. The families of the children are flying in. Sophia's parents should arrive tomorrow, and Kevin's family is driving up from Denver tonight. Marcus felt exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline of the past few days finally wearing off. He'd lost his friend Tom Whitfield, nearly died in an exploding mine, and witnessed horrors he'd never imagined. But 9 people were alive because of what they'd done. There's something else, Agent Chen said. Elena's ex-boyfriend, Carlos Mendoza, was arrested this morning in Denver. Turns out he was working with the trafficking ring. He gave them information about Elena's location at the shelter and helped plan her kidnapping. Elena's face darkened. I knew he was involved. He always said Dylan would be worth money to the right people. He'll be charged as an accessory to kidnapping and human trafficking. He's looking at 20 years minimum. Marcus stepped out onto the hospital balcony, needing fresh air and a moment to process everything that had happened. The storm was finally breaking, and he could see stars appearing between the clouds for the first time in days. Frank and Helen found him there, looking out over the lights of Cascade General. Hell of a few days, Frank said. Tom Whitfield saved us all, Marcus replied. If he hadn't created that distraction in the barn. He died doing his job, Helen said gently, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He'd be proud of what we accomplished. Marcus thought about Sheriff Whitfield's sacrifice, about the courage of Elena Vasquez in staying alive to save her son, about the determination of Frank and Helen in risking everything for strangers. Maybe there was more good in the world than he'd realized. What happens now? He asked. Now we go home, Helen said. We heal, we remember, and we keep living. It's what survivors do. Inside the hospital, Dylan Vasquez was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, safe at last. In other rooms, trafficked victims were beginning the long process of recovery and reunification with their families. The nightmare was over, but the healing was just beginning. Marcus looked up at the stars and said a silent prayer for his friend Tom Whitfield, wherever he was now. Then he went back inside to check on the people who had become his family over the course of 3 terrible, extraordinary days in the Montana snow. Part 7. 3 months later, Marcus Brennan stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana, facing 12 defendants who sat behind their defense attorneys with varying expressions of defiance and resignation. The trial of United States versus Rodriguez had become the largest human trafficking prosecution in Montana's history, and Marcus was the key witness who could tie all the pieces together. "Mr. Brennan," the federal prosecutor began, "please tell the court what you observed in the underground chamber on the night of February 15th. Marcus looked directly at Vincent Rodriguez, the tall, bearded man who had orchestrated the trafficking network. Rodriguez stared back without emotion, as if the deaths and suffering he'd caused meant nothing to him. "I saw a sophisticated operation designed to move human beings like cargo," Marcus said clearly. "Wooden crates with air holes, conveyor systems, trucks with Canadian plates. People were being shipped across the border without any regard for their safety or humanity." The courtroom was packed with families of victims, FBI agents, and media representatives. In the front row, Elena Vasquez sat holding Dylan, who was now healthy and alert, babbling happily as his mother watched justice unfold. Beside them sat Sofia Martinez's parents, who had flown up from El Paso for the trial. "How many victims did you personally witness in the mine?" 6 adults and 3 children in various states of consciousness. All showed signs of being drugged. The children had been kidnapped from different locations, playgrounds, shopping centers, their own homes. Defense attorney James Mitchell rose for cross-examination, his expensive suit and practiced demeanor suggesting he specialized in defending wealthy criminals. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it true that you were trespassing on private property when you allegedly witnessed these activities? I was trying to save a dying baby, but you had no warrant, no legal authority to enter that mine, did you?" "I had a moral obligation to save innocent lives," Mitchell pressed on, trying to create doubt about Marcus's observations and motivations. But Marcus had been preparing for this moment for months, working with prosecutors to ensure his testimony was clear and unshakable. The trial had already revealed the full scope of the trafficking network. Over 3 weeks of testimony, federal agents had outlined an operation that stretched from Mexico to Canada, involving corrupt officials, sophisticated communication systems, and safe houses in 6 states. Dr. Amanda Foster took the stand after Marcus, describing the medical evidence that supported the trafficking charges. "The children showed clear signs of chemical sedation," she testified. "The drugs used were consistent with substances designed to keep victims compliant during transport." Frank Kowalski testified about the mine's layout and the explosives that had destroyed the trafficking infrastructure. His detailed knowledge of the tunnel system helped prosecutors demonstrate how the operation had evaded detection for over 2 years. Helen Kowalski's testimony focused on the children's condition when they were rescued. Sophia couldn't stop shaking. "For hours," she said, "these babies had been terrorized, drugged, and treated like objects. The psychological damage was severe. The most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves." Elena Vasquez took the stand on the trial's second day, Dylan sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside the witness box. "They told me Dylan would be sold to people who wanted a baby," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "They said if I tried to escape or contact police, they would kill him. I believed them because I'd seen what they did to other mothers who resisted." Elena's revelation about other mothers led to additional charges and a broader investigation. The FBI had discovered that the network had been operating for 3 years. not two, and had trafficked an estimated 340 people during that time. Agent Sarah Chen presented evidence gathered from the mine and related raids. We found detailed records of financial transactions, victim profiles, and delivery schedules, she testified. This wasn't a random criminal enterprise. It was a business with profit margins, customer lists, and quality control measures. The financial evidence was staggering. The network had generated over $8 million in revenue, charging different rates based on the age and perceived value of victims. Children commanded the highest prices, while adults were often sold into forced labor operations. Marcus learned details during the trial that made his stomach turn. The Red Barn on the Kowalski property had been just one of 12 similar facilities across the region. Each barn served as a temporary holding station where victims were processed, documented, and prepared for transport. The mine had been the crown jewel of the operation, a transportation hub where trucks could enter through one shaft and emerge, miles away through hidden exits on the Canadian side of the border. The explosion Frank had triggered had revealed a tunnel system that extended almost to the international boundary. On the trial's fourth day, Sofia Martinez testified via closed-circuit television from a child advocacy center. At 4 years old, she was barely able to understand the legal proceedings, but her simple words carried enormous weight. "The bad men took me from the playground," she said, clutching the same stuffed rabbit she'd held during the rescue. "They put me in a box, and it was dark. I was scared, and I wanted my mama." Sofia's father, Roberto Martinez, broke down in tears as his daughter described her ordeal. He'd taken time off from his construction job in El Paso to attend every day of the trial, determined to see justice served. Kevin Walsh, now 5 years old, had recovered more quickly than the other children, but still suffered nightmares. His parents had relocated from Denver to a small town in Wyoming, hoping that rural life would help their son heal from his trauma. The defense attorneys tried various strategies to minimize their clients' culpability. Some claimed they were merely drivers who didn't know what was in the vehicles they transported. Others insisted they were victims themselves, forced to participate under threat of violence. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Recorded phone conversations, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses painted a clear picture of a criminal enterprise where every participant knew exactly what they were doing. Vincent Rodriguez had been the network's mastermind, a former cartel operative who'd moved to Montana to escape attention from Mexican authorities. His legitimate businesses, a trucking company and several restaurants, had provided cover for the trafficking operation. His lieutenant, Carlos Mendoza, had been Elena's ex-boyfriend who'd provided inside information about vulnerable women and children. The prosecution revealed that Mendoza had been paid $5,000 for delivering Elena and Dylan to the network. On the trial's final day, Rodriguez himself took the stand in a desperate attempt to save himself from a life sentence. His testimony backfired spectacularly when he tried to justify the trafficking as providing opportunities for people seeking better lives. "These people wanted to come to America," Rodriguez said, his accent thick with arrogance. "We provided a service that they requested and paid for, including 3-year-old children who requested to be kidnapped from playgrounds," the prosecutor asked. Rodriguez's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard enough. Deliberations lasted 2 days. Marcus spent that time at his ranch, trying to return to normal life, but finding it impossible to concentrate on cattle and crops when the trial's outcome remained uncertain. Frank and Helen had become regular visitors to his property, and the 3 of them had formed an unlikely family bond forged by their shared experience. They gathered at Marcus's kitchen table on the evening before the verdict, sharing a quiet dinner and remembering Tom Whitfield. Tom would have loved seeing those Bastards squirm on the witness stand, Frank said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. Here's to the best sheriff Cascade County ever had. They drank to Tom's memory, then sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset through Marcus's kitchen window. The view included the pasture where he'd first seen the tire tracks that had started this whole nightmare, Elena called that evening with news about Dylan's continued recovery. He's walking now, she said, her voice bright with joy. And he says Mama constantly. The doctors say there won't be any lasting effects from... What happened? What about you? Marcus asked. How are you doing? Better. The therapy helps, and knowing those men will be punished, it makes it easier to sleep at night. Elena had moved to a small apartment in Billings, closer to the support services she needed. The FBI had arranged for victim compensation that would help her rebuild her life, and she'd enrolled in nursing school with plans to help other trauma survivors. The verdict came on a Wednesday morning. Marcus, Frank, and Helen drove to Helena together, arriving at the courthouse as reporters and camera crews set up for what everyone expected would be a significant announcement. The jury filed in looking somber and determined. Marcus could see family members of victims holding hands, their faces tense with anticipation. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Patricia Morrison asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreman was a rancher from eastern Montana, a man whose weathered face reminded Marcus of his own father. He read the verdict slowly and clearly, his voice carrying the weight of justice. On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, we find the defendant Vincent Rodriguez guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Elena sobbed with relief while Dylan clapped his hands, not understanding the significance but sensing his mother's emotion. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Rodriguez's face remained impassive, but Marcus could see his hands trembling slightly as reality set in. All 12 defendants were found guilty on multiple charges. Rodriguez received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mendoza got 25 years. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. Outside the courthouse, Agent Chen addressed the media while Marcus watched from the background. This verdict sends a clear message that human trafficking will not be tolerated in Montana or anywhere else in America, she said. The courage of witnesses like Mr. Brennan and the victims who testified made this prosecution possible. Elena approached Marcus as the crowd began to disperse. Dylan was walking now, taking unsteady steps while holding his mother's hand. I never properly thanked you, she said. You gave me back my son and my life. You saved yourself, Marcus replied. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. No, Elena said firmly. You chose to stop. You chose to help. You chose to risk everything for strangers. That's not luck. That's character. Marcus knelt down to Dylan's level. The toddler grinned and reached out, grabbing Marcus's finger with a surprisingly strong grip. Hi there, Dylan. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. Dylan babbled something that might have been thank you, or might have been random baby talk. Either way, it made Marcus smile. 6 months later, Marcus received an invitation. That surprised him. Sofia Martinez was turning 5, and her family wanted him to attend her birthday party in El Paso. The invitation included a photo of Sofia smiling and holding a new stuffed animal, a horse that reminded Marcus of his ranch. He made the trip, driving 15 hours through New Mexico to reach the Martinez family's modest home. The party was small but joyful, filled with relatives and friends who treated Marcus like a hero despite his protests. Sofia talks about you all the time, Roberto Martinez told him. She calls you the cowboy who brought me home. Sofia had grown taller and more confident, though she still carried stuffed animals wherever she went. She spent the party showing Marcus her toys and telling him about kindergarten, seemingly unafraid, and healing well from her trauma. "Did you bring your horse?" she asked, referring to the cattle on his ranch that she'd seen in photos. "I brought you pictures of them," Marcus said, pulling out a photo album Helen had helped him prepare. "And if you ever want to visit Montana, you can meet them in person." "Can I ride them?" "We'll see what your parents say." The party reminded Marcus why the fight had been worth it. Sophia was alive, safe, and surrounded by people who loved her. Dylan was thriving with his mother. Kevin Walsh was recovering with his family. The trafficking network had been dismantled, and other potential victims had been spared, but the cost had been high. Tom Whitfield's widow, Sarah, still struggled with her husband's death. The psychological trauma experienced by the victims would take years to fully heal, and Marcus himself found that he couldn't look at his ranch the same way, knowing what evil had passed through his peaceful valley. Still, on good days like Sophia's birthday, Marcus felt that the sacrifice had meaning. 9 people were alive, and free because a few ordinary citizens had chosen to act when action was required. As he drove back to Montana that evening, Marcus thought about the randomness of fate that had put him on that county road during the blizzard. If he'd left his ranch an hour later or taken a different route to town, Elena and Dylan might never have been found. But he'd been there, and he'd chosen to stop. Sometimes that was all it took to change everything. 2 years after the trial, Marcus Brennan discovered that the story he thought had ended was far from over. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in October when Agent Sarah Chen appeared at his ranch gate, her federal vehicle kicking up dust as she drove toward his farmhouse. Marcus was repairing fence posts in his north pasture when he saw her approaching. Something about her posture, the urgency in her movements, told him this wasn't a social visit. "Marcus," she said, stepping out of her car, "we need to talk. It's about the Rodriguez network." "I thought that was finished. Rodriguez is in federal prison for life. The leadership is locked up, but we've discovered something troubling. The network was larger than we realized, and some of the connections reach much higher than we thought." They sat at Marcus's kitchen table, the same place where he'd planned the rescue operation with Frank and Helen 2 years earlier. Agent Chen opened a thick file folder, revealing photographs and documents that made Marcus's stomach tighten. 3 weeks ago, ICE arrested a man named David Patterson at the Canadian border, Chen began. He was carrying forged documents and a briefcase full of cash. When they searched his vehicle, they found this. She handed Marcus a photograph of a leather-bound ledger. Even from the photo, he could see it contained lists of names, dates, and financial figures. Patterson was Rodriguez's accountant, but he'd been laying low since the arrests. The ledger contains records going back 5 years, detailing transactions we never uncovered during the original investigation. Marcus studied the photograph. What kind of transactions? Payments to public officials, judges, police chiefs, border patrol agents, even some federal employees. The network was paying protection money to people who were supposed to be stopping them. The implications were staggering. The trafficking operation hadn't just succeeded because of sophisticated logistics. It had succeeded because law enforcement had been compromised at multiple levels. "How high does this go?" Marcus asked. "We're still investigating, but it includes people you've met. Remember Judge Harrison, who presided over some of the preliminary hearings? His name is in the ledger, Sheriff Deputy Williams from the neighboring county. He received monthly payments for looking the other way." Marcus felt sick. Judge Harrison had seemed genuinely outraged by the trafficking crimes during the hearings. Deputy Williams had assisted with victim interviews and had appeared dedicated to justice. What about our local people? Sheriff Whitfield's department? Tom Whitfield was clean, as were most of his deputies. But Marcus, there's something else. The ledger contains a list of planned operations that were never executed because of our intervention. One of them was targeted at your ranch. Agent Chen turned to another page in the file. They were planning to use your property as a secondary staging area. The isolation, the access to county roads, the fact that you live alone, it made you a perfect target. Marcus thought about the tire tracks he'd found on his property during the blizzard, the ones that had first made him suspicious. They were already scouting my land. Rodriguez's people had been watching you for months. If you hadn't found Elena and Dylan that night, they would have approached you within the week with an offer to lease barn space for agricultural storage. And if I'd refused, based on what happened to other landowners who wouldn't cooperate, you would have had an accident, nothing dramatic, a fall from a horse, equipment malfunction, something that looked natural. The coldness of it was breathtaking. Marcus realized how close he'd come to being murdered simply for owning land that criminals wanted to use. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because Patterson is talking. He's providing information about corruption and ongoing operations in exchange for witness protection. But some of the people on his list are still in positions of power, and they know he's been arrested." Agent Chen's expression grew more serious. "Yesterday, we intercepted communications suggesting that some of Rodriguez's associates are planning to eliminate witnesses before Patterson can testify. You're on that list, along with Elena, Frank, Helen, and several others." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "Are they all being protected?" "We're working on it. Elena and Dylan have been moved to a safe house in Colorado. Frank and Helen are staying with relatives in Idaho under assumed names. But Marcus, you've refused protection twice. You can't stay here alone." It was true. Marcus had turned down witness protection after the trial, unwilling to abandon his ranch and the life he'd built. But the situation had changed dramatically with Patterson's revelations. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Marcus asked. "At least 6 people who worked for the network, but were never identified. They're still free, still dangerous, and they have access to the same resources Rodriguez used. Professional killers, surveillance equipment, corrupt contacts in law enforcement." Agent Chen showed him more photographs from Patterson's evidence. "This man is Anton Kozlov, former Russian military, now working as an enforcer. This is Maria Santos, who specializes in making murders look like accidents. And this is the one we're most worried about." The final photograph showed a man in his 40s with cold eyes and surgical scars on his hands. Dr. Nathan Cross, former military surgeon turned killer for hire. He's killed at least 12 witnesses in other cases, always making it look like natural causes or medical emergencies. Marcus stared at the photographs, realizing that his quiet life in Montana had made him a target for people who killed for a living. "How much time do I have?" "We intercepted the communications 3 days ago. Based on their usual timeline, they could be here within the week." "Then we need to end this," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not running from my home, and I'm not letting these animals hurt Elena or the others." Agent Chen shook her head. "Marcus, these are professional killers. You're a rancher. This isn't a movie where the hero outsmarts trained assassins." "Maybe not, but I know this land better than anyone. And I've got friends who know how to fight." Before Agent Chen could object, Marcus was reaching for his phone. His first call was to Frank Kowalski, who answered on the second ring. "Frank, it's Marcus. How do you feel about coming home early?" "We've got company coming." "What kind of company?" Marcus explained the situation while Agent Chen listened with growing alarm. Frank's response was immediate and predictable. "Helen and I will be there tomorrow morning. You got enough ammunition?" "Probably not. We'll bring some." "And Marcus, call Jake Morrison. His son served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming back to run the ranch. If we're going to war, we need someone who knows how." Marcus's second call was to Jake Morrison, who listened carefully to the situation before responding in his characteristic drawl. "Well, hell, Marcus. Should have known you'd find more trouble. Yeah, my boy Danny can help. He's been bored anyway since he got back from overseas." Agent Chen was frantically taking notes, clearly planning to contact her superiors about this development. Marcus, the FBI cannot officially sanction civilian involvement in a federal operation. Then maybe the FBI should have caught all these people the first time, Marcus replied. How many other witnesses are dead because you miss the corruption in your own ranks? The question stung because it was fair. The FBI had declared victory after the Rodriguez arrests, but they'd missed a significant portion of the network and the corruption that had enabled it. I can't stop you from defending your property, Agent Chen said carefully, but I can't provide official support either. What can you provide unofficially? Chen considered this for a moment. Intelligence, communication equipment, medical support if things go wrong, and maybe some equipment that gets temporarily misplaced from our evidence locker. Frank and Helen arrived the next morning with a truck full of supplies and a grim determination that reminded Marcus why he'd survived the mine ordeal. Danny Morrison showed up an hour later, a lean young man with the alert eyes of someone who'd seen combat. Dad filled me in, Danny said, surveying Marcus's ranch with a tactical mindset. Good sight lines, multiple escape routes, defensible. Positions. We can work with this. They spent the day turning Marcus's ranch into a fortress. Danny identified the best positions for defensive fire, while Frank rigged early warning systems using motion sensors and cameras. Helen established a communications center in the basement, coordinating with Agent Chen's unofficial support. They'll come at night, Danny predicted. Probably try to make it look like a robbery gone wrong or a gas leak explosion. These people are professionals, but they're used to picking off isolated targets. They won't expect organized resistance. Agent Chen provided intelligence updates throughout the day. Kozlov arrived at Billings Airport yesterday under a false identity. Santos drove across the Canadian border this morning. We lost track of Dr. Cross, but his vehicle was spotted in Wyoming. 3 of them? Marcus asked. At least 3. There. Could be more. That evening they gathered in Marcus's kitchen for what might be their last meal together. Helen had cooked, despite the circumstances, insisting that soldiers needed proper food before battle. You know, Frank said, cutting into his steak, I never thought retirement would be this exciting. You didn't have to come back, Marcus replied. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't. These bastards threatened my wife, destroyed my property, and killed a good friend. If they think they can intimidate us into hiding, they don't understand Montana people. Danny was monitoring the perimeter cameras from his laptop, occasionally marking positions on a hand-drawn map of the ranch. Movement on the north fence line, he announced. Looks like surveillance, not an approach. How many? Marcus asked. 2. Figures, about 800 yards out. They're using night vision equipment taking photographs. Agent Chen's radio crackled from the basement. Marcus, we've got confirmation that all 3 targets are in the area. Kozlov's phone pinged a cell tower, 6 miles from your location. Dr. Cross's credit card was used at a gas station in town. What about Santos? No trace, which means she's probably the closest. Danny studied his tactical display. They're mapping our defenses, looking for weaknesses. Classic military reconnaissance. They'll attack tomorrow night when they've had time to plan, or they'll try to pick us off individually, Marcus said. Make it look like accidents. Not if we stick together and stay alert. They established watch schedules and defensive positions. Marcus would take the main house with Frank, providing support from the barn. Helen would coordinate communications from the basement while Danny moved between positions as a mobile reserve. At midnight, the first attempt came. The explosion knocked out power to the main house and shattered windows throughout the ground floor. Marcus dove for cover as gunfire erupted from multiple directions, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness around his ranch. In contact north and east, Danny's voice came through the radio. At least 4 shooters using automatic weapons. Marcus grabbed his hunting rifle and moved to a window, trying to identify targets in the chaos. These weren't the desperate criminals. they'd faced in the mine. These were trained killers using military tactics. A figure moved between the cattle sheds, and Marcus fired. The person dropped, but immediately rolled behind cover and continued shooting. Professional discipline under fire. "Frank, you okay?" Marcus called into his radio. "Barn's secure, but they're trying to flank us from the west. I can see someone moving through the pasture." Helen's voice came from the basement. "Agent Chen reports state police are en route, but they're 20 minutes out. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. The attackers had obviously planned for law enforcement response time. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the roar of a motorcycle engine. Someone was approaching fast from the county road, headlight cutting through the darkness. "Unknown vehicle approaching from the south," Danny reported. "Single rider, moving fast." The motorcycle skidded to a stop near the main house, and the rider jumped off, immediately taking cover behind the vehicle. In the muzzle flashes, Marcus caught a glimpse of the newcomer's face. It was Elena Vasquez, and she was carrying a shotgun. Elena Vasquez sprinted across the open ground toward Marcus's house, her shotgun held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, but she reached the porch without being hit. "Elena!" Marcus shouted through the broken window. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your life," she replied, sliding inside through the shattered glass. "Agent Chen told me you refused protection. I couldn't let you face these killers. Alone." "Where's Dylan?" "Safe with my sister in Phoenix." "But Marcus, there's something Chen didn't tell you. These aren't just revenge killings. They're trying to recover something." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Danny's voice crackled over the radio. "They're regrouping for another assault. I count 6 hostiles now, not 3. Eleanor checked her shotgun shells and positioned herself at a different window. Patterson's. Ledger wasn't the only evidence they're worried about. Rodriguez kept a backup drive with video recordings of his clients, powerful people who paid for specific victims. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. Blackmail material. Worth millions to the right buyers, or worth killing to keep it buried. The drive is hidden somewhere only Rodriguez knows, but these people think one of us might have found it. The gunfire outside had stopped, creating an ominous silence. Marcus could hear engines idling in the distance and the occasional crack of a radio transmission. "They're planning something," Frank's voice came through the comm system. "Too quiet out." "Here!" Danny emerged from the shadows near the barn, moving in a combat crouch toward the house. "Thermal imaging shows they're setting up for a coordinated assault. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they hit us from all sides." Eleanor pulled something from her jacket, a small device that looked like a USB drive. "I didn't come here just to fight. Rodriguez contacted me last week through his lawyer. He wants to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" "The location of the backup drive, in exchange for protection for all the witnesses. He's scared that Cross and the others will kill him in prison to keep him quiet." Marcus stared at the device in Elena's. "And that's it?" "No, this is a decoy, but Rodriguez gave me coordinates where the real drive is hidden. If we can survive tonight and get that evidence to the FBI, this ends permanently." The assault began with smoke grenades thrown through every window simultaneously, the house filled with thick gray smoke that burned Marcus's eyes and made breathing difficult. "Gas masks!" Danny shouted, but it was too late. The smoke was everywhere, and Marcus could hear footsteps on the porch, in the yard, moving toward every entrance. Elena grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward the kitchen. "Basement! Helen has gas masks down there." They stumbled through the smoke-filled house as gunfire erupted around them. Marcus heard Helen's voice over the radio, but couldn't make out the words through the chaos and the ringing in his ears from explosions. The basement door was locked from the inside. Helen's security protocol. Marcus pounded on it, while Elena provided cover, her shotgun booming in the narrow hallway. "Helen! It's Marcus!" The door opened, and Helen pulled them inside, immediately handing them military-grade gas masks from Agent Chen's misplaced equipment. The basement was clear of smoke, protected by a ventilation system Danny had rigged earlier. "Frank's pinned down in the barn," Helen reported. "Danny's trying to reach him, but there are at least 8 hostiles now." Agent Chen's voice came through, the radio with static interference. "State police are minutes out. FBI tactical team, helicopter." The transmission cut to static. Someone was jamming their communications. Elena was studying a map of the ranch that Danny had marked with defensive positions. "The coordinates Rodriguez gave me, they're here, on your property. He buried the drive near the old water tower." Marcus looked at the map. The water tower was 200 yards from the house, across open ground that was now occupied by professional killers. "Even if we could get there, how do we know Rodriguez is telling the truth? Because he's more afraid of Cross than... He is a federal prison. Cross killed Rodriguez's brother in Mexico last year to send a message. This is Rodriguez's only way to eliminate the threat." An explosion shook the house, and dust rained from the basement ceiling. Through the small basement windows, Marcus could see flames rising from the direction of the barn. "Frank!" Helen cried into the radio. "Frank, respond!" Static, then Frank's voice, weak but alive. "Barn's burning, but I'm okay. Had to fall back to the equipment shed." Eleanor was already moving toward the basement's exterior entrance. "I'm going!" "For the drive. You stay here and coordinate with the tactical team when they arrive." "Elena, that's suicide." "No, it's justice. These people destroyed my life, took my son, killed your friend. If that drive contains evidence that can put them away forever, it's worth the risk." Before Marcus could stop her, Elena was gone, disappearing into the smoke and chaos outside. He grabbed his rifle and followed, ignoring Helen's protests. The ranch looked like a war zone. The barn was fully engulfed in flames, casting dancing shadows across the yard. Gunfire echoed from multiple directions, and Marcus could see muzzle flashes from positions around the perimeter. Elena was running in, a zigzag pattern toward the water tower, using burning debris and equipment as cover. Marcus provided covering fire, his hunting rifle cracking as he tried to suppress the attackers. Danny appeared from behind the equipment shed, laying down automatic fire that forced several shooters to take cover. "Marcus, get to the tower. I'll cover Elena." The old water tower stood silhouetted against the burning barn, its metal ladder disappearing into the darkness above. Elena reached it first and began climbing, while Marcus covered her ascent. "Elena, where exactly did he bury it?" "North side, 3 feet down, marked with a red stone." Marcus found the stone and began digging with his hands, dirt flying as bullets. Whined overhead. His fingers hit something hard, a waterproof container about the size of a shoebox. That's when he saw Dr. Cross approaching through the smoke, medical bag in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. The man moved with surgical precision, each step calculated and purposeful. "Mr. Brennan," Cross called out in a cultured voice, "step away from the container. This doesn't have to end badly for you." Marcus raised his rifle, but Cross was already moving, faster than seemed possible for a man his age. The pistol fired twice, both shots hitting Marcus in the chest, but instead of the searing pain he expected, Marcus felt only the impact of bullets hitting the body armor Agent Chen had provided. He rolled behind the water tower base and returned. Fire! Cross took cover behind a piece of farm equipment, his medical training evident in how he assessed and treated a graze wound on his arm without taking his eyes off Marcus. "The armor won't help with a headshot," Cross called out. "Give me the drive and I'll make it quick." Elena's voice came from above. "Marcus, helicopter!" The FBI tactical helicopter crested the ridge, searchlights blazing and loudspeakers booming. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" Cross looked up at the helicopter, then back at Marcus, with something like professional admiration. "Well played, Mr. Brennan." The doctor's pistol swung toward his own head in one smooth motion. The single shot echoed across the ranch as Cross eliminated himself rather than face capture. The cleanup took hours. By dawn, federal agents had arrested 3 surviving attackers, documented the scene, and secured Rodriguez's backup drive. The encrypted files contained video evidence linking dozens of powerful individuals to the trafficking network. Judges, politicians, business leaders, even some law enforcement officials. Elena sat on Marcus's porch steps, exhausted but alive, watching Dylan toddle around the yard under the watchful eye of Helen Kowalski. The baby had been flown in by FBI helicopter once the scene was secure. "It's really over this time?" Elena asked. Agent Chen nodded grimly. "Rodriguez's evidence will destroy what's left of the network. The corruption cases alone will take years to prosecute, but the trafficking operation is finished." Frank emerged from the equipment shed with minor burns and a satisfied expression. "Barn's a total loss, but the cattle are safe. Insurance should cover most of the damage." Danny was breaking down his tactical equipment, preparing to return to his father's. "Ranch. You know, Marcus, you might want to consider a different line of work. Ranching seems dangerous around here." Marcus looked out over his property. The burned barn, the bullet-scarred house, the churned earth where professional killers had died. Then he looked at Dylan playing in the dirt, at Elena's relieved smile, at Frank and Helen holding hands despite everything they'd been through. "No," he said finally. "This is home. We'll rebuild." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot, watching Dylan take his first steps across the yard of the rebuilt barn. Elena had decided to stay in Montana, finding work at the local hospital and building a new life far from the violence of her past. The trials were ongoing, but Patterson's testimony and Rodriguez's evidence had already brought down a federal judge, 2 senators, and the head of a major transportation company. The trafficking network that had seemed so powerful was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Tom Whitfield's name was engraved on a memorial in the town square, honored as a hero who died protecting innocent children. His sacrifice had started a chain of events that ultimately saved hundreds of lives and exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. Marcus never found out why he'd been driving that particular road on that snowy February night. Maybe it was chance, maybe fate, maybe just the random intersection of need and capability that defines heroism. But he'd stopped when he saw someone who needed help, and that simple decision had changed everything. In the end, that was enough. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any. Upload from us.